Hello, American literature students. This is, of course, your professor, Elena Koch, and I wanted to make a short video this week to talk briefly about contemporary literature and the authors we'll be discussing, as well as the assignment due next week, the expanded essay assignment that I know some of you have been thinking about quite a lot already. But first of all, contemporary literature. As you know, this is the second week that we're studying contemporary texts. And last week when we were reading Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, I asked you to consider ways in which the novel seemed to be doing similar things to what the modernists were doing. So some of this has been discussed in our discussions and might be a little bit of review for you. So the dates for the contemporary period are 1945 or 1950 or so until the present. In other words, it begins when the modern period ends and it goes all the way to the present. Now that timeline is broad, right? That's a big period of time. Contemporary literally means of our time. So this is the literature of our time. But if you look back to 1945, 1950, literature of 70 years ago might not seem all that contemporary to us anymore, relatively speaking. So one of the challenges of talking about the literature of this period is that it is such a broad period. Some people refer to this period as postmodernism, and I want to suggest that postmodernism, or if you're really hip, you might call it POMO for short, refers to a certain kind of fiction or literature of this period. Last week in the discussions, I used the phrase modernism on steroids, and what's meant by that is the qualities that we talked about last week with modern experimentation are simply amplified quite a bit in a lot of contemporary literature. So, for example, in the modern period, we talked about taboo subject matter, taboo topics, and we certainly see that in the contemporary period. Writers are willing to address topics that before would not have made it to the publication stage, probably. Topics that challenge us and that might make us uncomfortable. We also see increased experimentation with form. So, for example, the chronology, the timeline of the plot. We've talked about alinear plots quite a bit. We've talked about the use of flashback in The Great Gatsby. Well, compared to The Underground Railroad, The Great Gatsby was fairly linear. In The Underground Railroad, we have an extensive use of flashback, of the author going back to fill in some gaps, starting a section like North Carolina in the present with South Carolina with Bessie, and we still don't know who Bessie is. And then Whitehead goes back in time to fill us in on how Cora and Caesar came to settle in this North Carolina place and how Cora came to be known as Bessie. That might be disorienting, and the writer has to do a lot of work. Or imagine how the novel would have been different if from the beginning of the novel we knew that Mabel had died in the swamp on her way back to be with her daughter. Imagine if we had known that, how different our reading experience might be. So those of us who were hoping and hoping that Cora might find out more about Mabel or even run into her, we see what a different novel it would have been if Whitehead had made different choices. So you see a lot of that in contemporary literature, that playing with the timeline. You might also see other experimental devices. So, for example, the use of runaway slave ads in Whitehead. The major sections of the novel begin with an actual slave ad that a slave owner would post, hoping that somebody would return the escaped slave to him. And so just the use of those real ads is experimental. But then Whitehead uses a fictional one. He writes one for Cora right before the last section of the novel. And in it, he actually gives us information about her that might affect the way that you interpret the end of the novel. It does for me, at least. So that's a very unconventional storytelling mode. I'm going to see if I can break out here of my PowerPoint and show you another thing. Where I am right now is on the website of Jennifer Egan, who's a contemporary author. Her most recent novel is called Welcome to the Goon Squad, and it's a series of collected short stories, connected short stories that make up a novel about people in the music industry. And it begins in roughly the present, but it ends in the future. And one of the chapters in this novel is this section that we're looking at right now, chapter 12. It's called Great Rock and Roll Pauses by Allison Blake. And when you encounter this in the novel, we don't know who Allison Blake is. In the novel, you just flip through these images on the page. But here you can see this unconventional format. What this is basically a PowerPoint, a slide journal that this narrator is keeping. And after you read a little of it, you can deduce that the narrator, Allison, is a 12-year-old girl. She's writing about her tense relationship with her mom. She's writing about her workaholic dad, and also her brother Lincoln, who the reader might deduce may have autism. And you might have heard that audio. So Egan is using rock and roll samples because Lincoln's fascination is with rock and roll songs that have pauses in them. So this is a really great example of the use of experimentation with form and with subject matter in contemporary literature. If you have 15 minutes to spare, go check this out. Again, jenniferegan.com, and the name of this story is Great Rock and Roll Pauses. Okay, let's go back to where we started. Okay. Okay, so if you have any questions about any of that, let me know via discussions or email. Another important part of the contemporary literature period is the opening up of the canon. We haven't talked about the canon for a couple of weeks, but you remember, I'm sure, from week one that the canon is a body of texts and their authors who are widely considered to be excellent. And you might remember that in the first week we talked about some of the difficulties with the concept of the canon because of who was excluded, because of the kinds of privilege it took to be able to get a work included in the canon. You needed to be educated, you needed to be a good writer, you needed to have access to a publisher, all of those things. And also because of the way society worked, because of the economics of publishing, there were all kinds of reasons why writers of color or women writers were kind of left out. Also, the idea of excellence is a subjective notion that changes over time. So what we see in the contemporary literary period is so many more authors contributing their voices. African American authors, Latino authors, GLBT authors. We see a huge opening up of the canon and much more diversity. Along with that comes the audiences for that. We no longer assume that only African Americans want to read African American authors. Instead, African American authors are much more widely read, for example. So that brings us to this week's readings. We're reading short stories, short fiction by 4 different authors. The first is Flannery O'Connor, a self-described Catholic and Southern writer. Her stories were published in the 1950s. I want you to try to hear a Southern accent, if you can, when you read these. She is known for her very dark sense of humor, which some of my students really love, and others find just too strange. Weird things happen in both of the short stories. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is that O'Connor has claimed that all of her stories are about central Christian or Catholic mysteries. So keep that in mind as you read the story, both stories rather, and use the reading guide for more information. We'll then be reading a short story called Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, one of the most influential African American writers, one of the most influential American writers, period, of the mid to late 20th century. Sonny's Blues was also written in the 1950s and is narrated by an older brother in Harlem. Think about the setting of Harlem before the Civil War, before the Civil Rights Movement, wrong century. When you read Baldwin, I want you to pay attention to how beautiful his language is. Again, see the reading guide for more information. Then we're going to jump forward a few decades to Sherman Alexie. You may have heard of him. He's still writing today. He's got a memoir that just came out last month. The short story that you're reading is from his collection, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven. It's set in the Spokane Indian Reservation in Washington State. And here we shift to a first-person narrator who's a 12-year-old boy. Pay attention to how Alexei experiments there and how he's using pop culture combined with traditional Native American themes to communicate a message. And finally, we're ending with excerpts from We the Animals, which is a short novel made up of connected short stories. Torres is a Latino writer. He is probably in his 30s. Still writing. This novel, We the Animals, came out in 2011, and you're reading the first 4 short stories. Again, please read the reading guide before you start reading these stories for a little more context. Okay, so now what I want to do is go to our class homepage and look at what's coming up for this coming week. So you've maybe already noticed this, I hope you've already noticed this announcement about what we'll be doing for week 7. The reading assignments I've just mentioned. Here are the deadlines for the next for the next week of our class. Next Saturday is when your 7th response paper is due. Remember, only 5 get graded. So if you have done 5 that you're happy with, you do not need to submit the 7th one. If you have submitted 5 or 6 already and you still want to write the 7th one, that's great too. I will be dropping your lowest 2 grades for the response papers, including zeros, obviously. Okay, and then coming up a week from Monday, July 17th, is your expanded essay assignment, which has been posted for you for a couple of weeks, and then the final exam. So let's look at the final, the expanded essay assignment. If we go to content, under the first section, essential course documents, you see, this is getting to be quite a long list. A couple of the things that you'll want to use are these handouts, writing about literature. The using textual evidence is kind of overlaps with writing about literature. And then a quick guide to grammar and punctuation markings in case I've made abbreviations about your sentences that don't make sense. Start here. If you can't find it, make sure you ask me. But this has a list of some of those things, okay, and an explanation. But here's what I wanted to look at. The thing that's listed last right now, the expanded essay assignment. I don't want to do that. Here, let's do this. Thanks for bearing with me. All right, so the assignment, as you know, is to pick 1 response paper from weeks 1 through 6. What you pick it's totally up to you. A lot of people like to pick their strongest paper because they know they're already starting with something strong and don't have far to go. They're on the right track, they feel, to keep it a strong paper. Others might pick a weaker paper because they want to challenge themselves to do better. Really, for me, it comes down to which paper do you have something additional to say about? Because you're taking a paper that might be 300 to 600 words and you're going to make it into a 900 to 1500 word essay. So you're going to want to expand on it. I want to see effective revision. I will be doing a side-by-side comparison of where you started and where you ended up. So I'll be hoping that you address my comments. If you're looking at a comment that I made and it doesn't make sense, you don't understand it, make sure you let me know so I can have a chance to explain it to you. Okay? Your thesis statement is going to be especially important in this video, or in this paper, excuse me. You're going to want to have an argument, a point to make that's debatable. So for example, in the Underground Railroad, Cora does not develop as a character. She is still as emotionally stunted as she was at the beginning on the Randall Plantation. If that's your thesis, that's definitely debatable. Some readers are going to disagree, but it's also a good thesis because you can support it. I assume you can support it with evidence from the text, and that's what you want to do as well. So make sure that you have a specific, debatable, and supportable thesis statement. And then just remember the other basics of writing about literature, all the English 101 stuff about writing in general, good focus and structure and all of those things. Okay, I know you've looked at this assignment already. Make sure you read it extra carefully before it's due and let me know if you have any questions. I always enjoy reading this kind of revised essay because I really like seeing how students develop their ideas and improve on what they've started with. So good luck with that. You know where to find me if you have any questions, if there's anything that I can help you with at all. Have a great week.